All right. Good morning, folks. I hope everybody can hear me out there. I can't see comments or anything as we're going through this, but hopefully y'all can see my screen and y'all can hear my voice. Skip, if you're listening, feel free to jump in if you see questions maybe in the chat box that need to be answered immediately during the presentation that pertain to that what's being talked about at that moment. Feel free to jump in with those and I'll answer those questions. Otherwise, we can save kind of the general questions for the end, and I'm happy to stay on and answer whatever questions need to be answered. So my name is Stephen Janak. I'm an extension program specialist in the Department of Horticultural Sciences at Texas A&M. So I'm actually stationed, have an office in Hallettsville, Texas, just north of Victoria, about an hour. And I live in this area, and I generally work over the southern half of the state of Texas, studying olives and primarily olives, but I'm also studying some other fruits, blackberry, pomegranate, pears, table grapes. I think there was one more thing, but kind of working on a special project, but olives are my main focus. And so I thought I would share my experience in the last 2 years working with Texas olive growers. So this is the general, as I visit folks that have olive orchards around the state, the story is very similar for most of them. They've traveled to one of the olive producing countries and areas of the world, usually the Mediterranean region. They've gone to Italy, they've gone to Spain or Greece, and they've seen the olive orchards there, they've seen the terrain there, and they say, man, this looks a lot like back home in Texas, and for good reason. So this picture here, you might wonder, is this really Texas or is this Europe somewhere, another olive producing region of the state? And this in fact is Texas, just up in the hill country. Here's another example, not in the hill country, but actually is Texas, but one could see how it could be mistaken for somewhere in Europe or one of the other olive producing areas of the world. This one too, somebody could make an argument that, well, is this Texas or Europe? And to me, it kind of looks like it could be part of the hill country or western area of the state, but in fact, this is Spain. So we see similarities in the geology and topography of olive growing regions around the world with where we're growing them in Texas. So a little botanical information on the olive first. The olive tree, the one we're talking about is Olea europaea, the scientific name. There are some other trees in Texas that go by the name of olive. There's Russian olive and Mexican olive, and those, while the Mexican olive may be related to this European olive, they are not the same. In the family Oleaceae, so olive has its own family. The fruit is actually considered a drupe.
There you go.
And we would just take a moment to remind folks, if you would please, when you join, go ahead and mute your mics and turn off your video, just to save bandwidth on the presentation and to reduce the background noise. So the olive tree is native to the Mediterranean region in the Middle East. So when you think of that region, we think of hot, dry, and moreover, we think of the climate as being influenced heavily by the Mediterranean Sea. That body of water has a great influence on moderating their temperature and their weather in that region of the world. And that's going to play into the talk later on today. Olives were introduced to the U.S. and California by early Spanish settlers, the 1700s, and there's over 2,000 varieties of olives in the world. We're playing with a handful of them here in Texas, but there are many that can be had. So you can see why people in Texas, folks in Texas, thought, well, maybe we are suitable for olive production in Texas. Here's the Mediterranean region where lots of olive production is happening, and we're at similar latitudes. So there's California right smack dab in the middle. Here's Texas right at the southern end, and so folks think that there's potential for olive production in Texas. There are olive production also going on in other parts of the world, Australia, Peru, Argentina. They're also producing some olives and olive oil in those areas. Speaking of California, this was a trip I took last year to California, and this is just olive trees on the side of the road, and you can see how this thing is just loaded with fruit, with probably no real maintenance or upkeep or fertilization. They just have the right climate, the right situation over there. Here's a general map of some of the farms, some of the olive orchards I work with in the state. So you can see they are somewhat restricted to kind of this middle or southern middle portion of the state. Below, above about this area, we get a little bit too cold and olives have an issue with freezing. We'll talk about that. Below this area, about this line to Corpus Christi, they do not fruit reliably. We think there is an issue again with the weather, with the climate, that we don't have enough cooling temperatures in the southern half of the state. So these orchards here in the middle seems to be to press for 1 gallon of oil, and each individual tree can yield from about 30 to 120 pounds per tree. I have not seen any tree in Texas that's yielded up to 120 pounds. I think the most that I heard was a 20-year-old mature tree that produced 80 some pounds 1 year. But olives do have a tendency to alternate bear like pecans. If they have a heavy crop 1 year, they are likely to have a lighter crop or no crop at all the following year. So this is kind of what growers in Texas are experiencing. A lot of them start with these smaller trees, what we call a whip, or they're planted in what we call a 4-inch pot. We start with these. They're about 12 to 18 inches tall, and they grow them by year 2 or 3. They should have reached this height, and you can see they're staking them up, keeping them growing straight. And if everything goes correctly, by year 3 or 4, we can start to flower and set some fruit if in that location. Lots of Texas growers are growing olives in a super high density setup. So this isn't a super high density orchard along the Texas Gulf Coast. This is Matagorda County. And so these trees are spaced about 5 feet down the row and about 13 feet between rows. And so these, obviously, there's quite a few acres here at this farm. These are going to be mechanically harvested. And so there's a few big mechanical harvesters in the state. These are specialty harvesters. So you can see the opening in the middle of the machine here. The tree goes down the middle, and these white plastic bars shake back and forth and basically shake the fruit off of the tree. And then it's like a combine. So it has an arm or an auger that comes out, and the fruit can drop into these baskets. So this is mechanized olive harvest. And here's a short video. We don't really need sound, so I'll turn that off. And here you can see the tree going through the middle. And it looks fairly violent, but trust me, these olive trees are quite flexible and tough. They can be bent and can bend without breaking, so to speak. So this is the other alternative, though. For those that do not have a harvester, this is what's going on. They're spaced out. You can see the spacing between the trees is much greater, generally about a 20 by 20 spacing. They're pruned differently. They have a wider pruning, and then everything is done by hand. So you call all your friends and neighbors and buddies, and you say, I'll cook you barbecue. Would you please come over and help harvest fruit? Because this is a labor-intensive job. Labor-intensive for sure. Then the fruit has to be milled. Most of the olives grown in Texas are grown for olive oil, and so there's mobile mills that travel around and can come to the orchard, can be set up outside, and then of course there are stationary mills that are inside of buildings. And so here's another example of one on the Texas Gulf Coast. So the hopper here, the fruit goes in. First step on any kind of machine is the washing of the olives, again, to remove any dirt or debris that may be on them, make sure they're clean. Then they go up this long auger and drop into the heart of the mill, what we call the hammer, or the hammer mill. So here you see the auger where the fruit comes in. This circle here falls into this area, and so these are the 3 steel hammers. And the fruit is basically smashed or pounded or ground between these hammers and this steel mesh that you see here. So here's a mill that's put together. So the steel hammers inside, and this steel mesh on the outside that grinds and pounds the fruit into a pulp or into a paste. And of course, in that process, if you have anything besides olives that you're trying to run through that hammer mill, it can be quite dangerous or scary, especially if something like a rock or a piece of metal goes through. And so olive millers talk about their moo that they collect. This is a material other than olives. So everything that they have found in bins of fruit as it comes to the mill, they try to pull out and save from damaging their machine, their olive mill. Once the fruit is ground into a paste, it goes into what they call the malaxer. So this is the empty malaxer on the left here, and on the right here is a video. So you see the olive paste inside. And what the malaxer does is basically massage the olive paste, move it back and forth gently. This helps to release the olive oil from the fruit material, and also helps the oil come together and kind of rise to the top of the paste, so that it may be more easily extracted and removed off of the paste from the malaxer. So here's the big malaxers in the back, these square things. From there, it's pumped through this hose into not a centrifuge. I'm blanking on the name of this machine right here. Basically, the paste travels down this tube this direction, and this machine is designed to separate the paste, the solids, from the liquids. So the liquids come out in this hose right here. So here's olive juice. This is basically pure olive juice. So this is oil, olive oil, but it also contains some water because there's water in the olive fruit itself. So the last step that the olive juice has to go through is through this centrifuge. And so here's the centrifuge here. This is what separates, by spinning, by centrifugal force, separates water from oil, and then pure oil comes out the end here. And this is green Texas gold. And if you've never tasted this kind of fresh, high quality extra virgin olive oil straight out of the mill, you likely would never go back to the store-bought brands again. This has it's just a phenomenal flavor, freshness to it, versus sometimes what we get in the store is not quite to that kind of quality. So let's talk about growing olives in Texas. Actually, there are plenty of challenges. Okay, there are plenty of challenges. The main one, in my opinion at least, is what we're looking at here: freeze damage on olive trees. Freeze damage. So remember, olives are a Mediterranean crop. They're adapted to this Mediterranean climate. Now, they are tolerant down to about 12 degrees when they're mature, but Texas does not have this Mediterranean climate. We have a continental climate. Our climate is more heavily influenced by the continent of North America than it is by the Gulf of Mexico. We do have some influence from the Gulf of Mexico, but our weather is more heavily influenced by the continent. That means, as you all well know, our Texas winters, we can have very warm weather in December, January, February. We can get up to 75, 80, 90 degrees in the winter. And since this olive tree is an evergreen tree, does not lose its leaves in winter, it does not really go dormant like some of our deciduous trees do. So with temperatures above 70, 75 degrees in winter, this tree starts to wake up. It starts to move sap again. It starts to lose its cold acclimation. And then, as you well know, we can go from 80 degrees one day, we get that cold front swings down from the north, and we can drop to below freezing in a matter of hours. This is what is so hard on olive trees in Texas. We just do not have the Mediterranean climate that's so moderated and so mild in the winter. They love our hot, warm, dry summers. And they love a mild winter, but they cannot handle our extreme swings in temperature. So this is why we have variety trials going on across the state. So here's a good example of a variety trial near Fredericksburg. This is Gillespie County, kind of a northern region where it gets plenty cold. So you can see this tree on the left almost untouched by freeze damage, and the one on the right almost burnt all the way back. And just the growth, the size that it was able to achieve over a number of years is far beyond this variety here. So we're starting to get some data on what can be tolerant of our cold conditions here in Texas. If we can get the orchard or the trees to survive the weather, our next main challenge is a soil-borne fungus called cotton root rot. Excuse me while my foster dogs bark. There's no known reliable cure for cotton root rot. It's not, the name cotton root rot does not mean that your area, your orchard, has to have been planted in olives before, planted in cotton before. That's just the crop that we noticed it most in was cotton. So even if your area has never grown cotton before, you can still have the fungus for cotton root rot in the soil, and it can affect the trees. There is a fungicide that is effective protecting these trees from cotton root rot, but it's not labeled yet, so not legal to use, which may be available later this year or next year, but until it is, we won't talk too much about it. So cotton root rot is very prevalent in more alkaline, especially heavier or clayier soils, and it's especially associated with wet conditions. So wet, clay, alkaline soils are very susceptible to cotton root rot. For example, here's an orchard I'm working with. I created a map, so all the green cells are healthy trees. 2 is not so healthy, 3 is really struggling, and then here's all the red ones are dead trees, all the black ones are confirmed cotton root rot trees. And so cotton root rot tends to have this pattern where it pops up in certain areas and then spreads over time. So you kind of have a hot spot here, and we see it kind of spreading out, but doesn't affect every tree. So that's another one that we're still working on and kind of learning about as far as olives are concerned. If cotton root rot is not the problem, we've seen plenty of issues with Phytophthora root rot. This is another one, native in Texas soils, again associated with wet conditions. Phytophthora root rot tends to affect trees that are, again, in heavier soils or are overwatered. And there's not a great solution or cure for these. There are some fungicides and soil drenches that can be used. Our experience with those in olives in Texas is they have not been extremely effective. The best is to plant them in a well-drained soil and not to overwater them. As far as insects and disease, olive trees are relatively low maintenance and disease and pest free, but there are some general plant feeders that we have found on olives in Texas. So here's some hieroglyphic moths. Their larvae may feed on the leaves. This is again from Matagorda County. Here's a sphinx moth caterpillar. He's a big old guy. He had some big feces that was big droppings on the ground that were pretty interesting to see. We think there's maybe some grasshopper or katydid damage that can happen to fruit. In fact, here's a grasshopper on the olive tree itself. We've seen snails be prolific in some orchards, but haven't quite identified that they've caused any real problems. This is fall webworms. Most of you have probably seen fall webworms in pecan trees and oak trees and different trees. So they're general plant feeders, and so we've seen some occurrence of them on olive orchards, but nothing that couldn't be handled. Probably the most common pest for olives in Texas has been Blackscale. So scale insects are these tiny little bumps, and they're called that because they have this waxy scale covering over their bodies to protect them when they're adults. They pierce into the plant and then suck sap from the inside of the plant, and when they excrete that sap, it falls on lower leaves or on lower stems, and a black sooty mold grows on that excretion, and so we see this blackening of leaves and stems. And it's not a problem. The fungus is not the problem. The mold is not the problem. The root of the problem is the black scale insect. Now, if they get bad enough, the black sooty mold can inhibit photosynthesis, and so that's one way that sooty mold may be a problem. But the real problem, again, is the scale insects, and they can be controlled with various horticultural oils, dormant oils, summer oils, and then there are some other insecticides that can be used on black scale, in addition to some cultural methods that we can use to help keep their numbers down just by thinning the tree, opening up, and exposing it to some more sunlight and wind and heat. This is a picture here of what has been to date our most destructive pest in Texas olives, something that we found and documented last year. This tiny I'm sorry, that got cut off there. That's supposed to say 4. So 4-spotted Palpita moth. The larvae of this moth are olive tree foliage feeders. So here's the larvae itself. Here's the adult moth, and so you can see the 4 spots on each wing, hence the name 4-spotted Palpita moth. This guy is native to Texas, native to North America in this area. They feed primarily on plants in the Oleaceae family. And so we think they've been here a long time, and they feed on, so this is an example of a Waxleaf Ligustrum. Waxleaf Ligustrum is also in the Oleaceae family. This is actually at an olive orchard that had a bad problem with these caterpillars in their olive orchard, but about a quarter mile away was their house and their landscaping. They had this ligustrum tree, and sure enough, I found more of these larvae on their ligustrum tree. So we think they've been in Texas all along. It's just that now we've planted these huge expanses, sometimes 10, 20, 50, or 100 acres of olive trees, and we've just planted a huge habitat and host for these larvae to feed on. So we saw some pretty significant damage last year in a few orchards. Not only do they feed on the foliage, but they feed on the developing fruit as well. And you can see almost every fruit in this picture has been fed and damaged by these larvae. So there are caterpillars not that difficult to control. I won't go into extreme detail because this is supposed to just talk about olives and olive oil production, but BT products were effective. We tried some BT here and we're highly effective at controlling them. There's other insecticides that can be used to control lepidopteran pests, which are caterpillars on fruit trees. We saw a high number of predators in the orchard actually with using BT and steering away from overuse of other chemicals. These are predatory stink bug nymphs feeding on a caterpillar on an olive tree last year. So we don't think we could rely on predators alone because we still saw a high level of damage and fruit loss due to this larvae, but we did have quite a few predators feeding on those larvae. So those are the big challenges, the big pests and the big diseases with olives in Texas. So I'll talk now about kind of cultivation of olives and my observations working with olive growers in the past 2 years. Overall, far and beyond the rest, Arbequina is the variety that's most common across the state of Texas. It's one of the most cold hardy varieties. Remember, we talked about cold hardiness being an issue. It has fruited in all of the olive growing regions of Texas, from far west in Val Verde County and Del Rio to almost to Beaumont in far east Texas. It's fruited even down in the southern tip of Texas. We actually had some fruit in Weslaco last year on the Rio Grande border, Mexican border, but it grows better a little bit farther north, like I say, with a little better winter chilling. But Arbequina has fruit in all areas of the state. I'll talk more about this issue right here in a bit. The fruiting is inconsistent among years and even among trees in an orchard. As you walk down the row of trees in an orchard, no matter the variety, and this is one of the oddest things about this crop, and it's one of the things that I'm working on most heavily, as you walk down that row of trees, you may have the first tree is loaded with fruit. The next one may have no fruit. The next one may have a handful of fruit. The next one may have no fruit. The next one may be loaded. And we do not see a pattern yet. We have not found a reason. All of these trees are genetically the same. They all share the same genetics because they are asexually propagated. They are propagated from cuttings. And so they all have the same genetics. They're all treated the same way in a row in an orchard of trees, and yet we have issues with inconsistent fruiting, even among rows of trees in an orchard. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But as I said, they're relatively pest-free. I know I showed you some pests already, but when compared to some of the other fruit crops we grow in Texas, like peaches, olives are relatively pest-free. And there has been some excellent and, in fact, award-winning olive oil made in Texas. When we get it right, we can make, or not we, but the growers have made some really excellent olive oil, and I encourage you to try and go out and purchase some if you can. We think there's about 3,000 to 4,000 acres of olives in the state, although that's hard to exactly nail down, but there are more orchards being planted every year In fact, I'm working with several right now that went in this year. Most of the orchards are around this 3 to 6 to 10 acre size, although we do have some larger ones. As I've traveled around and talked to these growers, here's some of the common stories I heard. Unfortunately, this is what I heard a lot of. We lost the entire orchard to freeze for the first 2 years. So they replanted 1, 2, or even 3 times before they got their trees to survive. And on that note, I'll tell you, I was talking with a grower in the hill country, so a little bit more of a northern area where they have a little cooler temperatures and more harsh freezing. And I asked him, he has mature trees. I asked him, well, how did you get them to survive those first few winters? Because once they get some size to them, once they get established better, they get a bigger canopy on them, they tend to be more tolerant of the cold. And it's not a genetic adaptation as they get older. It's just that their canopy gets larger and they can retain more heat, trap more heat that's rising from the soil. So I asked him, what do you think is the secret to getting these trees to survive the freezing in the first couple of years? And he actually did finally admit that he thinks you just kind of have to get lucky. You plant in a year and you have good establishment and good growth. And those first couple of winters you hope are mild. You hope that you do not get these extreme swings from above 75 to below freezing overnight. And if you can manage that, then you're probably well on your way to establishment. Some of the other stories I've heard, there's so much labor involved. Again, as people have started to harvest their olives by hand, they've realized how much labor is involved. Even the pruning done by hand can be quite intensive. And then here's this story again, this thread again. The trees are 7 years old and healthy, but have never set fruit. And so we have orchards, entire orchards, in fact, that are in this situation. They have mature trees that should be of producing age. They're healthy. They have full foliage. We think that they have done everything correctly, and yet they have never flowered and set fruit. But these orchards are in decently close proximities to other orchards that actually have flowered and set fruit. So all of this is to say that we have some unknowns with olives in Texas. Folks in Texas have only really been growing olives since about the mid-1990s is when they really started to catch on. And we've been studying them as far as Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. We've been studying them for even less time than that. So this is the common thread, is that if we can grow the tree, the fruit production is low and erratic when compared to California and other parts of the world. And we have some theories that may be related to climate or weather, soils, or maybe we don't have fertility just right. Maybe it's our management. But likely, as with most things in life, it is likely a combination of all of these. Our soils are different from California. Our climate and weather are definitely different. We're trying to match the fertility recommendations from California research, but again, we're still having this issue. So we're thinking maybe our fertility needs in Texas, because of our different soils and climate, maybe our fertility needs are different than in California. So there's been some research done in the past about our weather and its effects on olive tree production and fruiting. So some of the early works had said that they thought there was a need for winter chilling. Like we talk about with peaches and other stone fruit, they need a certain number of hours below 45 degrees. But that's been refuted. In fact, there was some research done, I can't remember if it was California or Texas, but they took trees and placed them during the winter in a controlled environment that stayed exactly 45 degrees all through the winter, and then in the spring they moved them out into the natural temperatures. And those trees that stayed at 45 degrees all winter long, they fruited to their full potential. And so we don't think that there's necessarily a need for a certain amount of hours below 45. But we do know that there is some need for chilling because trees that have stayed, again, in experiments, trees that stayed above about 65, 70 degrees, those trees do not flower. So we do know that there is some need for cooling. So then there was some research done in Weslaco that refuted this chilling theory. with controlled studies, as I talked about, but they did identify an interruption on flowering, or on the development of the flower buds, what we call flower induction. So the experiment found that trees that were exposed to this 6-day period, again during the winter, if they experienced 6 days or more above about 77 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of the canopy of the tree, those trees tended to fruit very little or none at all. And so we have this theory of this high temperature interruption of the flowering induction, this development of the flower bud on the olive tree. And so we think that this right here probably plays a large part in explaining why perhaps fruiting in Texas is erratic, is much lower than California numbers. And so we're doing more work to study. Again, I've got studies across the olive production region. Each one of them has a weather station, and we're going to kind of analyze some of that data and see if we can't make this provide some evidence to support this, I guess is what I'm saying. So both of these studies point to excessively warm winter and spring as being a problem with fruiting olives. And again, they are a Mediterranean crop, so maybe we just don't have the right conditions for them. They do love well-drained soil, as we talked about. So poor drainage leads to cotton root rot or Phytophthora root rot. The literature suggests they prefer alkaline soils, although we've got plenty of orchards growing in more acidic soils. And again, those alkaline soils, we do see cotton root rot because it's more prevalent in alkaline type soils. As far as pollination, Arbequina and a few of the other varieties are self-fertile. They do not need a pollinizer species, a pollinizer variety planted with them, but most varieties do need a pollinizer, and even some of these self-fruitful varieties can fruit heavier with another variety close by to act as a pollinizer. As far as selecting variety, again, our variety trials are kind of in their early years. We're just getting into some production the last couple of years, so our data is young, still being proven, but there are some good patterns we've already seen. Arbequina is ranked in the top number 1 or number 2 out of 7 of 9 sites for over the past 2 years, and that's ranking them based on survival, okay, their adaptability to the climate, and then on their yield. Secondly, how much fruit can they produce? And finally, they're judged on their size. You know, how much growth can they achieve once planted in this area? So Arbequina, again, far and beyond the rest, has outperformed the most. For the warmer sites, you know, about south of I-10, we see some other trends. Oleana also performs well. Koroneki performs very well. Arbesana does well, again, in these warmer sites. But when these type of varieties are moved to a more northern area, say Austin, San Antonio, College Station, these sites, these varieties do not perform well. They freeze back every year or almost every year and have trouble setting fruit in a more cold climate. And so, as I talked about, we're trying to find some varieties that have better cold tolerance. This Aguilando has done fairly well. When we look at these results here from Gillespie County, there's Aguilando. It's got 100% survival and the largest, most growth out of any of these other varieties, except there's Arbequina with good growth, although 1 or 2 trees died. But again, look at Gillespie County. The yield, 0. One means 0 fruiting. 4 means heavily fruiting. So no fruit production in Gillespie County yet. Too much cold, we think. So we're still finding out if there's a good tolerance for cold as far as olive trees in Texas. There's also some consistency in the low rankings. Manzanilla, Tosca, Coratina, some of these varieties consistently end up at the bottom of the list, and so we're steering away from recommending those. Here's some different sizes of olive fruit grown in Texas. So all the way from this is Sevillano, kind of a table olive. This is Picual and Mission. I'm forgetting what these are, but this is more the size of Arbequina. These right here, this would be Arbequina, Arbesana size. These smaller, more pointy fruit would be Koroneki. And I believe these are Oleana here at the bottom. So we have a great difference in sizing of fruit. As far as planting and spacing, nothing real special. Just don't plant too deeply like every other fruit tree. As I said, they're not grafted. They're rooted on their own roots. So they're planted on their own roots. So we don't have a graft union to guide our planting depth. We just want to make sure that the topmost root stays at or above the native soil level. Again, they do need plenty of space. Arbequina and most varieties can grow into large trees, 15 by 15 foot or even bigger. But olives, in my experience, are fairly adaptive and responsive to pruning. We can kind of keep them pruned down to a desired size and shape and not lose too much or sacrifice too much production or health of the tree by keeping them pruned down to a more desirable size. Hand harvest orchards are typically planted, as I talked about, 20 to 25 feet spacing, and they fruit best in full sunlight. Again, this is an evergreen tree from the Mediterranean, Middle East region, so they love sun, they love heat, and that's why we think they may be a good adaptation for Texas. So here's kind of the pruning style we think most homeowners should be shooting for, kind of this open center. It can be multiple trunks or single trunked. But olives bear fruit on their 1-year-old wood, so the wood, the twigs that were grown last year, that's where you're going to have fruit around the periphery of the tree. And so instead of growing, like an oak tree that's got one solid round canopy on top, we want it open so that we don't have fruit production just on the outside. We can have fruit production on top and throughout the middle of the tree. And so except for high density orchards, olives we think should be pruned kind of to this open center. Here's a big mature olive tree. It's about 15, 20 years old. Has not been, or it was opened up in the past, as you can see. So there's fruit here on the periphery of the tree. Turn that sound off. But as you go inside the canopy where there's no sunlight, you see lots of dead twigs and branches. So this is wasted space. There's no fruit production going on. And these twigs that don't receive sunlight simply die off because they're not useful to the tree. So we think at about this stage of size that tree should be topped right there. The main leader should be cut off and encouraging lateral branching to take place. We want it to grow out this way instead of straight up. Fertilization, like I said, we're still very early in our understanding of olives' needs in Texas. So there's more work needed to fully understand. The best we have right now is to rely on leaf tissue analysis. That is taking leaves from the tree, sending them to a lab to be analyzed, and that tells you how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and all the other micronutrients are actually in the tree. So what the tree is actually being able to pick up out of your soil. That's kind of our best analysis for guiding fertilization. Plus, we want to make sure we can estimate fertility needs by looking at how much growth was made. And so we're shooting for about 8 to 18 inches of new growth every year. Less than about 8 inches, again, remember they fruit on last year's growth. So less than 8 inches doesn't allow a whole lot of area to set fruit. More than 18 inches of growth means that we've got excessive growth. This tree is in more of a vegetative state rather than a productive state. And so we need to back off on the fertilizer and let this tree kind of slow down in its growth and put more effort into reproducing versus growing long stems and leaves and branches. And so we recommend right now just some light applications of a balanced fertilizer. Again, a soil test, as you've all probably heard, is your best guide to knowing what's in the soil and what it might need. But in the absence of that, just some light applications of a balanced fertilizer in spring for the first 2 years. Excuse me. If enough growth is not being seen after that spring application, there can be an application made in the summer to encourage a little more growth. But we do not want to fertilize olives after about August. And again, I talked about cold sensitivity and cold acclimation. Well, if we push them too late with fertilizer, they may be too vigorous and too actively growing going into winter, and that leaves them more susceptible to freeze damage. Again, we want these trees to kind of shut down, kind of go to sleep, not actively growing, so that they can harden off and acclimate to our cold weather and survive our freezes. The weed control, just like every other fruit crop, the trees benefit from weed control. It conserves water and nutrients, reduces competition. This gives better growth. In addition to that, moist, bare ground beneath trees during the winter will help capture the sun's energy and release that energy in the form of warmth overnight. So this offers maybe a few degrees of cold protection. And so we think it's probably best to maintain bare ground beneath olive trees in the winter, especially if you're in a more northern area that tends to see these extreme fluctuations and swings in temperature. So I've talked about 40 minutes now on olives. This is kind of a wrap-up slide here. They must have well-drained soil. They do not tolerate they do not tolerate wet feet. They are drought tolerant, but they produce the best with sufficient water. So alkaline soils are preferred, but they are susceptible to cotton root rot in those alkaline soils, and we've seen them grow fine in more acidic soils. Full sun is best. Again, for most homeowners with one or two or a few trees, we prune to an open center for a hand harvest. Again, light penetration, new growth to the inside of the tree, more fruit production. Again, drought tolerant, but they fruit best with sufficient water supplied. We want to avoid excessive fertilization, and we want to avoid late fertilization beyond August. And despite all of our best efforts thus far, fruit production is low and erratic. I'm sure if we could hear from some of the growers, if there's anybody tuning in that has an olive tree, I'm sure they would, you're going to hear, oh, mine fruited in the third year after planting. Oh, but mine is 8 years old and it has never produced fruit. These are common stories, common threads when it comes to olives in Texas. So again, we're working on our understanding of these issues and of this crop. So there's our website, our Aggie Horticulture website. Lots of resources on there, as you should know. There's a fact sheet on that website pertaining just to olives. And I suppose at this time I could take some questions if there was questions on olives. Hopefully I hadn't been talking just to myself for the last 40 minutes or so. Yes, and this is me eating peaches at home when I was a kid. Do I need to read the comments? I don't see any questions in the comments. Okay.
Anyone has a question and would like to ask, feel free to type it in, and Stephen will be happy to answer.
Absolutely. What table olives do well here? Well, so we don't have anybody in the state that's actually producing table olives for commercial production. We have some growers. I mean, I'll tell you, we have growers that use Arbequina as a table olive in Texas now. It's not recommended as a table olive, but there are folks that have taken Arbequina fruit and brine them and can them or preserved as a table olive. For table olives, though, I'd probably recommend, yes, this, thank you, Skip, this link that he's put there in the chat box has, it's our fact sheet on olives. It has a list of varieties, and it actually describes which ones are more commonly used for table olives. The table olive that you buy in the stores is typically manzanilla. And again, I could show you my data, but as we talked about in the presentation, manzanilla has done quite poor across all regions of Texas, even the more southern regions that have less issues with freezing. I do know one grower that has some more mature manzanilla olive trees, but they don't fruit a whole lot. The fruit that they do produce is good, but it's probably not a variety I'd recommend for everybody. You can try it, but otherwise refer to this fact sheet here about which varieties are suitable for table olives. How to propagate olives? That's a good question. if you figure it out, let us know. To be honest, folks, I have not tried propagating olives. I'm not worried about it. I'm more concerned and focused on helping growers and getting these trees to produce fruit and getting the fruit harvested. So I'm not worried about propagating olives. What they do in California is take softwood cuttings, so cuttings that are less than a pencil thick from new growth in about midsummer. And they keep them in a moist growing media like potting soil, but I think it's no soil in it. It's maybe peat moss and vermiculite, perlite, and they keep it moist. They spray it they mist it with water constantly, or every 15 minutes or so to keep a moist, humid environment. And I'm sure they apply some rooting hormone, but beyond that, I actually have no guidance on how to propagate olives successfully. I've heard from some growers that it's very hard. I have some growers that have tried following methods online, following methods from California, but they've had in fact, I don't know that they've had any success propagating olives except maybe one or two trees. Let's see, I planted 4 Arbequina olives in late winter and noticed a little deer damage recently, but not much. Have commercial growers had any problems with deer? Yes. Thank you for that question, Ty. I should have put that in the presentation. The commercial growers, every single one of them has a game fence around their orchard. I know a grower not far from me here in Colorado County that had their orchard in place. I believe it was about 19 acres, and they had it planted for 2 or 3 years, and the trees were alive and doing okay, but they just weren't seeing growth. The trees weren't getting bigger. And lo and behold, somebody looked at their orchard and said, "Oh, you got a deer problem." They put up a fence. The very next year, here comes the growth. So yes, deer love olive trees. I'm not sure why. The foliage and fruit is quite bitter and not tasty, because I've eaten both the foliage and the fruit right off the tree, and it's not tasty, but I guess the deer love it. Yes, Mission or Pequal for table olives. Those are your bigger fruited olives that be suitable for table. Is our native olive related to the commercial species? Native olive. I think you're talking about maybe the Mexican olive. The Mexican olive is kind of grown in the southern half of the state. The fruit tends to be a similar size, but the fruit on Mexican olive turns more white and is more soft. I think it's used for making soap, but while they're in the same family, the Oleaceae family, they're not any closer related than that. There is a Russian olive. Don't be confused by Russian olive. If you ever see Russian olive, that's a non-native invasive species that you don't want. So don't get Russian olive. I have a Koroneki Greek olive tree that seems to be doing well in a pot. Do you know of this variety? Yes, Linda. As I talked about during the presentation, Koroneki, at least in the southern regions of the state, Koroneki does very, very well. It's a smaller fruited tree. That I showed that picture of the different sizes of fruit that have come from Texas. It's one of the smaller fruits produced by olives in Texas, but they can be very productive, and the oil that comes from them, if you can produce the oil, is very unique, kind of a spicy flavor, while still being green and fresh. So yes, Koroneki does well, but it is somewhat sensitive to cold temperatures. Yes, Koroneki, thank you for sharing propagation comments. All right. It looks like I got all the questions for now. Would be happy to take any more. It's been a fun crop to work with. Plenty of challenges, and plenty of work to do on it still. But as I said, those that have produced fruit and have produced oil, it is excellent quality oil. Some folks have asked, since this is a Gulf Coast presentation, olives on the Gulf Coast of Texas, some people have asked how they do with humidity, and there was some speculation that they would not do well with high levels of humidity. And I will say that, again, we have orchards growing in Matagorda County. They're growing on Galveston Island. They're growing in Beaumont, between Houston and Beaumont. So these high humidity areas. And as long as they avoid some of these other issues we've talked about, freezing, cotton root rot, Phytophthora root rot, wet soils, as long as we avoid those issues, the trees do well along the Gulf Coast in a humid area. They grow well, they fruit, not excessively, but just as much as the other areas of the state. So I don't see a big issue with humidity and olives on the Texas Gulf Coast. Oh, message. Great job. Thanks, Kevin. Thank you. Well, we've been at this almost an hour. I'll hang on for a little bit, and if anybody else wants to talk or has a question, I'll be happy to answer those. Otherwise, my information is here. You guys feel free to contact me if you have questions, and I'm happy to help. Thank you.
Just want to remind everybody that this is an ongoing series, and next week we have gardening in containers. The week after that, turf irrigation audits, home citrus growing, young tree care, and a host of topics all the way up through early October so far planned for the program. So please tell your friends about it and join us again on future Wednesdays at 10 a.m.
Stephen, we need to have you come down to Corpus and go out to the botanical gardens with us and take a look at the varieties we have out there.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd be happy to. I'm planning to kind of get around the state a little bit, maybe here at the end of July, and then towards the end of August when it comes to harvest time, I'll be traveling a bit. So absolutely, we should make some plans to check it out.
I think you could come and maybe if we time it with one of the Master Gardener meetings, you could come in either to them or to our Garden Council and do a presentation for them.
Sure. Hey, let me answer this question. Adolf, if you're listening, you asked, where can I buy olive trees? So I've seen olive trees even at your big box stores, Walmart, Home Depot, these kind of commercial stores. Typically, all they have available at those bigger stores are Arbequina, which again is fine. That's the variety that, if you're going to grow only one type and you want more reliable fruit production, a little bit better cold tolerance, that's the variety I'd probably recommend is Arbequina. So you can get those usually in the spring at your bigger box stores. Otherwise, there's online ordering from different nurseries, and some different nurseries and I don't know if I should mention nursery names, but you can search, Texas nurseries online. There's some that have different varieties, mostly Arbesana, Kornecki, you'll find also, sometimes Oleana. And then besides box stores, online, and your local nurseries, if you want some of the more different, less common varieties, there's an orchard, and I only mention it because it's the only one that I know of, not that it's a recommendation or endorsement of anybody, but there's an orchard near San Antonio called Sandy Oaks Olive Orchard, and she has tons of different varieties, usually in 1 to 3 gallon pots for a reasonable price. She's got some of those other, the Mission, the Piqual. I'm sure you could even find Manzanilla and some of those other varieties that are less common. But Arbequina you can find at the right time of the year at big box stores. The next I would do is look online, and at other Texas nurseries, you can usually find Arbequina and maybe a couple other varieties. And then for those less common varieties, I would call Sandy Oaks Olive Orchard. Do I need to have more than one to increase my chances of fruiting? So I talked about that a little bit back here in the presentation. There are some varieties that are self-fertile. So Arbequina, again, is one of the most self-fertile varieties that really doesn't require a pollinizer variety to be planted near it. But even those self-fertile varieties, and especially the self-incompatible varieties, yes, they do better with another variety planted nearby. And again, if you go to that website or the fact sheet that was shared up here, our Texas Olive fact sheet from Aggie Horticulture, it's got a little bit of information on those varieties, which ones are self-fertile, which ones need pollinizers, what pollinizers to use for which varieties. So the short answer to that is yes, but yes, it can help increase your chances of fruiting, but it's not absolutely required for some of those self-fertile varieties. You're welcome.
Well, Stephen, looks like we've kind of wrapped it up. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people did too.
You're very welcome. I had a good time. It's been fun, so happy to share. Yeah, I guess it's nearing 11 o'clock. I think we should wrap up. Thank you to everybody, and if y'all need anything, don't hesitate to give us a call. That's what we're here for.
For those still hanging around, we did record the session, and it will be made available once we get that processed and edited to people who want to go back and listen to it again.